The next speaker is Meredith Doig, the President of the Rationalist Association of Australia, and she's going to address the issue of reason versus emotion. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Chris. That's really opened my eyes, and the further that we can spread that particular piece of insight, historical insight, the better. I think, well done. Okay, I'm not going to read a paper. I'm going to give you some... Okay. I'm going to talk to some slides. I'm not nearly as good a writer as Chris is, or David. I'm indebted to David for setting the broader context for what I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to say is going to be fairly high level, and before I get into the issue of the reason and emotion as key drivers in moral and other progress in human society, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about rationalism and the rationalist society, because it's a little bit complex, and as David's overview said, the word rationalism has changed its meaning over history. So just bear with me for a little bit, and I'll go through that and then come back to reason and emotion. Okay, so what is rationalism? There's two broad interpretations of rationalism. One of them is more historical, the other is more contemporary. One is really philosophical, and the other is more political. So there's a philosophical interpretation and there's a political interpretation. The philosophical interpretation, as David mentioned, is, and it arose during the Enlightenment period, and that was really that the nature of reality can be established by thinking, by reason alone. Okay. People like Plato originally, what could be considered to be a rationalist, Descartes, the philosopher who famously said, "I think, therefore I am," Spinoza and Leibniz. These are all philosophers who are associated with the philosophical interpretation of rationalism. Now, they were essentially in opposition to the people that David has mentioned, the empiricists. The empiricists like John Locke and David Hume, who, as opposed to saying that you can understand the world just by reason alone, by thinking alone, they said, no, you've got to use the senses. You've got to actually go out into the world and collect data through the senses. Aristotle would be an early empiricist. Now, perversely, the modern rationalist movement owes more to the empiricists than it does to the early philosophical rationalists, because the political formulation of rationalism is that it opposed irrational beliefs, and especially the supernatural. Why? Because there is no evidence. Basing its approach on empiricism, it basically said there is no evidence for supernatural beings. So it also then opposed all arbitrary authority based on such beliefs, and that of course meant that it opposed the church. So rationalism today, through the Rationalist Press Association in London, and then it came in the early 20th century to Australia, it really owes more to empiricists than to the early philosophical rationalists. We would say these days that there are three essential pillars of rationalism as it's known, at least in the rationalist society. And they would be these. Firstly, naturalism, which is that the real world, the natural world, is the only world there is. So hence, we don't believe in heaven and hell, we don't believe in life after death. That's the first pillar. Secondly, humanism. That is, that humans create their own meaning in life. There is no meaning of life, beyond what humans create. It's not given by any sacred text, doesn't come down on high by any supernatural deity. And thirdly, that rationality, that in forming our beliefs, humans should rely on empirical evidence and logic and the scientific method, and not on obedience to any authority or blind faith, or uncritical assumptions. So that's just wanting to put rationalism as it shows up today in a bit of context. So this shows up in the history of the Rationalist Society, which, by the way, started in 1906. There were a group of people who got together in Ormond College and Melbourne University, and they had been distributing pamphlets from the Rationalist Press Association in Melbourne and through Australia. And then they decided to formally form a society or association. And they took their early aims directly from the aims of the Rationalist Press Association in London, in the UK, which you can see on the screen, although I can't see the bottom of it. I'll have to read it out to you. That the attitude of mind that unreservedly accepts the supremacy of reason and aims at establishing a system of philosophy and ethics independent of all arbitrary authority. It should be. However, of the recent years, there were some internal critics of this definition of rationalism, in particular two words. One being unreservedly. Could rationalists really unreservedly accept anything that seemed to be against the very idea of rationalism being something that is always open to new evidence and scientific method? And the supremacy of reason. Because these days, as I'll get into shortly, we know that reason is not supreme by itself. There is an intimate interaction between reason and emotion. So we did actually change that definition of rationalism in the formal aims, the constitution of the Rationalist Society, and this is what it reads now. The principle that all significant beliefs and actions should be based on reason and evidence, that the natural world is the only world there is, and that answers to the key questions in human life are to be found only in that world. So that's the new definition that the Rationalist Society has adopted fairly recently as a result of the internal review and reflection. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that background to the Rationalist Society in Australia. Let's get on to the topic, which is reason versus emotion. And we'll go back to the ancients to start off with. Plato saw reason and emotion as two horses pulling a chariot in different directions, while the charioteer desperately tries to make them work as a team, but they were trying to go apart. And the idea that was that emotion prevents the exercise of pure reason. And this is an idea that obviously affected thinkers for hundreds of years. And then I won't go through from the ancients through Machiavelli, who had a big change. He was one of the major thinkers that started to change from idealism to pragmatism. But during the Enlightenment period, people like Descartes was the sort of thinker who agreed with the idea that reason was superior to emotion. But then there was David Hume, who basically said, no, reason is actually a slave to the passions. Reason is a slave to the passions. So he was contradicting Descartes. Modern philosophers like Peter Singer, Australia's Peter Singer, could be called another person who would be a long-term disciple of Bentham through a series of utilitarians, could be called a strong utilitarian. But his argument is he doesn't argue that reason is superior to emotion, rather he acknowledges the role of emotions, but says it is reason that allows humans to go beyond being a slave to the passions. That led, and I won't go into too much detail about it, but utilitarianism is one major school of thought in the history of moral progress. The other one is deontology. Utilitarianism is the school of thought in philosophy that focuses on the consequences, the outcomes of thought and action. Deontology, on the other hand, doesn't focus so much on the outcomes, but on the means to the outcome. They have different forms of defining what is good, what is right and proper. But suffice it to say that these two schools of thought made a contribution in history towards, they analysed reason and emotion in different ways. So let's just come up to the present day and think about whether or not reason or emotion won out in the end. And I think it's probably true to say that David Hume was right. What we know about the way that the brain works these days is that emotionality wins. We are a slave to our passions. And why is this? Well, oh, sorry, before I get on to that. Emotionality wins. In the present day, we have emotionality in films. We have emotionality in politics. We have emotionality, the cute, in the internet, and in advertising. So realistically, if you look at the way that at least modern Western civilization works, you would have to say that emotionality wins over reason. Now, why? And it works. Ask any marketer or advertiser, emotionality works. But why is this? So what we now know is that through neurobiology of the brain, is that we know, and forgive me if there are any biologists in the room, so this is very high level, but at a very high level, we know that there are two major parts of the brain that are engaged when we think about things and when we make decisions to take action. The first one is called the amygdala. This is part of the limbic system, and it's been shown to be the area of the brain that is largely associated with emotions, emotional reactions. The second, in the top left-hand side, is the prefrontal cortex. This has been shown to be the area of the brain which is most associated with intellectual logic and reason. But what's happened is that there's all sorts of research these days to show that these two areas of the brain are intimately connected. If you damage one part of the brain, it affects the other. So if you damage the amygdala, it affects the capacity to make logical decisions. If you damage the prefrontal cortex, it affects the personality and the emotions of the personality. These two areas are intimately connected. There was a research by a fellow called Antonio Damasio who studied people with damage to those parts of the brain where the emotions are generated, and his research showed that they couldn't make decisions. They could describe the decisions they were supposed to make, choose between a ham sandwich or a turkey sandwich, but they had no basis upon which to make the choice. Many decisions have pros and cons on both sides. So how do we decide, for example, to choose pathway A or pathway B? People with damage to the amygdala have real problems making logical, what we might think of as logical decisions. Further, the lack of ability, his research showed, to make decisions extended to moral decisions. These people, in the research experiments that he set up, it was demonstrated that they could lie, they could steal, they could cheat, they could ignore punishment. They couldn't think through very simple moral dilemmas, like if you're watching two people watching TV, and they don't agree on what to watch, upon what basis could you resolve that moral dilemma? So these are people with damage to the amygdala. There is other research, on the other hand, on the prefrontal cortex that shows that damage to the prefrontal cortex severely affects the emotional personality. Everybody in this room will have heard of lobotomy. A lobotomy is where the connections to the prefrontal cortex are cut. It was used for decades, up to the 1970s, to treat really serious psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia. And almost always it resulted in major damage to the personality. I didn't know this, and you may not either, that John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary Kennedy, had a lobotomy at the age of 23 and was basically a vegetable for the rest of her life. So these are modern research that's shown this intimate connection between the areas of the brain that generate emotion and the areas of the brain that are associated with logical reasoning. Another way of looking at this is written up in a wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, called Thinking, Fast and Slow. And he got his Nobel Prize for his research on decision-making, economic decision-making. Now, in this book, he proposes a way of thinking about the way that the brain makes decisions, the way the brain thinks. And he labels it System 1 and System 2 type thinking. System 1 thinking is the sort of thinking that's involved in, if you're driving down an empty road late at night, but you're actually involved in cognition when you're driving the road, but you're not aware of it. System 1 thinking is the sort of thinking that comes up with an automatic answer to bread and butter, or 2 + 2 = 4. It's fast, it's spontaneous, it's automatic, and it's often emotional. System 2 thinking, on the other hand, is the sort of thinking that has to be engaged if I ask you to multiply 17 by 23. Or fill out a tax form, or try to focus on a particular person's voice when you're in a crowded, noisy room. So System 2 thinking is effortful, it's focused, it's slow. It also takes a lot more energy than System 1 thinking, which is why We tend not to use, we tend not to engage System 2 thinking. We tend to rely on System 1. Problem with relying on System 1 thinking is that it indulges in lots of cognitive errors. The cognitive errors occur because we rely on existing patterns that are part of System 1 thinking. We tend to use that because System 2 thinking is more effortful, takes a lot more energy. The brain, like any other organ in the body, tries to minimize the amount of energy that it uses. So it tends to use System 1 results, which are not necessarily logical. So cognitive error, confirmation bias, selective perception. These are all very natural cognitive errors that we all engage in. So System 1, System 2 thinking is another way of describing the sort of thinking that originates in the amygdala, System 1, and the sort of thinking that is effortful in engaging the prefrontal cortex. Now, another way of I wanted to try to give you a link to a little video that I know Victor was keen on, where Steven Pinker, who's a psychologist, and Rebecca Goldstein, who is a philosopher, engage in a conversation. But you'll have to look it up on TED.com. I can't link it, but what I am going to do is read to you. It's really interesting because it's the very first animated discussion that's been put up on TED.com. What's interesting about this is that Steven Pinker and Rebecca Goldstein are married to one another. So this is like listening in to a dinner time conversation between a philosopher and a psychologist. And what they were discussing was, has reason thinking lost its power? In other words, in the face of the modern day superiority, it seems, of emotionality, has reason really lost out? So Goldstein starts off this little discussion bemoaning the fact that reason appears to have fallen on hard times. Modern pop culture and politics have reached new depths, and there's a rise of religious fundamentalism. But then Pinker wonders whether that's really such a bad thing. Maybe we've just overrated reason. We now know, he says, through psychology and through neurobiology, that we are in fact ruled by our bodies and by our emotions. And we tend to use what very small powers of reason we actually have to simply rationalise our decisions after the fact, rather than engaging System 2 thinking. So, he says, is it reason that has led to moral progress, or is it really our emotional powers of empathy or human kindness that's been responsible for most of the moral progress over the centuries? Goldstein counters, and she says, no, well, perhaps reason not by itself, not just pure logic. She argues that you need to have two further conditions. The first of these is that the people who indulge in reason need to care about their own well-being. That's pretty obvious. We all care about ourselves and our own well-being. But the second condition is that the reasoners live in a society where we can affect one another's well-being. And obviously we can do that, and we do that, through the power of human language. So that was her response that to Pinker, that reason, perhaps it's been overrated. No, she says, it's really, really important. But then he says, well, does it really work in practice? We know that human society has become less violent. He wrote a major book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Decline of Violence, in which he demonstrated conclusively that human society has become, over the millennia and centuries and decades, much less violent and less cruel. So he says, maybe this is just empathy and sense of fairness that have motivated these social changes. But then she says, no, this is not enough. As Adam Smith argued, we're moved by a minor personal injury. We're more moved by a minor personal injury than the death of thousands in faraway places. Empathy, natural empathy, originating in the amygdala, is biased towards ourselves and our tribe. It's not empathy, but reason, she argues, that's expanded our circle of empathy. Why is this? It's because cognitive dissonance bothers us. It's hard for people to hold contradictory viewpoints or values in mind for any length of time. And over history, she argues, there have been thinkers like Bentham who've argued why a particular practice was indefensible or inconsistent or irrational. And she gives examples, the modern anti-war movement can trace its roots back to the 16th century and the humanist Erasmus. John Locke in the 17th century challenged, and was one of the first, to challenge the prevailing acceptance of slavery. And Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century argued against the casual cruelty to animals that was rife at the time, and also the then social abomination of homosexuality. So finally Pinker concedes, and they together agree that it wasn't just emotionality that caused moral progress, but emotionality combined with the power of human reason to argue against inconsistent ideas, irrational ideas, indefensible ideas. And together they reflect on what else might fall to the relentless power of logic in the future. Three things that they came up with. Firstly, the mistreatment of animals in factory farms. Secondly, the ban on contraception through appeal to religious standards. And thirdly, the scrimping on donations to life-saving charities in the developing world. And I'm sure everybody in this room would have other matters that you could add to those lists. So, in the end, is it really reason versus emotion? I would argue no, it's not reason versus emotion. Reason is not separate to emotion. What we need is a better understanding of modern neuroscience and a better exercise of the skills of critical thinking. We need to raise to greater public awareness about the understanding about cognitive errors, the fact that we tend to fall back on system one thinking, and that's perfectly natural. That's the way that emotion is essentially the source of our thinking and therefore our decisions, but we can choose to engage system one thinking, and that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Sorry for that last one. We can engage system two thinking.
Absolutely. It's a choice.
Yeah.
It's a choice
Yeah.
to engage the prefrontal cortex, recognising that our instincts, the impetus for our thinking, comes from the amygdala, but we need to engage consciously, and effort, it takes effort and energy.